we're going to be dealing with a number of practical halacha um, of Yom Tov. Okay, so what we had learned yesterday was that we went over the story of Reb Tzadok, how he did not eat in the sukkah, even though everyone else, the other rabbis, were machmir to eat in the sukkah. When they brought him stuff, he didn't eat in the sukkah, and he basically they brought him bread that was less than the size of an egg, and he didn't even wash. He held it with a napkin, and he ate it outside a sukkah. He didn't even bench. It was less than the size of an egg of bread. We mentioned yesterday that Reb Tzadok held api halacha that the obligation of benching is only on a kibetza, on an egg, and he doesn't. If it's less than an egg, you don't have to bench. The obligation of washing tilas yadayim is also only if it's on an egg. So he didn't. He didn't, according to Rashi, he only used a napkin because of cleanliness, but really he didn't have to wash. And according to Tues, he used a napkin. It seems like pi halacha. He held you need to use a napkin.
Did he say a bracha achrona on the kazayas?
No. No, he didn't say a bracha achrona because he holds that you only say a bracha achrona and after bracha on a kibetza. And we don't hold like
that's for bread. But what about other foods? Is it
he didn't eat other foods. He only ate bread.
Oh.
He only ate bread. So on bread you don't say a bracha achrona. So so the question was, and he ate it outside the sukkah. So the question was, the Gemara dealt with. So does that mean that if it would have been a kibetza, then he would have needed to eat it inside a sukkah? Is that a proof? And the Gemara says no. It could be even if it was a kibetza, you don't have to eat it inside a sukkah. But if it was a kibetza, then maybe he would have benched. Then for sure he would have benched. If it was a kibetza, then he would have washed out until Yadayim with the bracha. But because it wasn't a kibetza, he didn't. Because it wasn't a kibetza, he didn't do those things. But eating in a sukkah, we don't know if a kibetza is enough to obligate you to eat in a sukkah, or does it need to be more, which brings us back to the Gemara that we learned before on page 26, and machlokes between Rabbi Yosef and Abaye. If a person eats more than a kibetza, he has to eat in a sukkah, or is it more than 2 or 3 kibetzim that he's obligated to eat in a sukkah? A kibetza is an egg, size of an egg. So what is the size? So again, we don't have a proof what Reb Tzadok did on what his halacha, what he held about sukkah. But the bottom line is, I mentioned yesterday that when it comes to washing for hamaitzi, it turns out that there's an obligation a person has to wash even if he only eats a kazayas. You don't say al natilas yadayim, but you would wash for bread. And we bench even on a kazayas, so you would bench regular benching. Even though Reb Tzadok did not do that, but we don't paskin like Reb Tzadok. We hold that on a kazayas. You could bench, but you cannot say al natilas yadayim. So if you're eating a very minimal amount of bread, you just want to be yoitza, whatever it is, suda or something, you have your kazayas, then you wash and don't say al natilas yadayim. Only if you have double that, the double olive size, double kazayas, that's the size of a kibetza, then you would say al bracha al natilas yadayim, say that bracha. But we always wash, even if you have a tiny amount, you would still have to wash. Yes, Victor.
So let's say a person was stuck on the road and he had like bread that I guess it was less than a kazayit, but he didn't touch the bread. He did like what the Rabbi Tzadok did. He held it in a napkin, let's say, because he was stuck. There was nowhere to watch. He was on the road. Is that something that's
I'd have to look it up in Shulchan Aruch, and I don't have in front of me a Shulchan Aruch here, but Yeah, it sounds, Reb Tzadok did that. Reb
Yeah.
Tzadok washed, he did that. It sounds like there is some type of heter. Taisus is bothered with what Reb Tzadok did. He says there's a Gemara that in Chulin he brings that the Gemara in Chulin, it basically says that you can't really do that for even a Taisus brings that he's surprised that Reb Tzadok did, because he says even a kibetza you could do that without netilas yadayim, for if you're eating truma. It wouldn't work for taharis, but it will work for truma. So Taisus is bothered, like, why did Reb Tzadok, what makes it sound over here in the Gemara that only because it was less than a kibetza, that's why he was allowed to do it. But if it's more than a kibetza, it sounds in our Gemara like you can't do it for a regular kibetza. But Taisus is bothered. Even if it was a kibetza, you should be able to do it if it's truma, which makes it sound like there probably is such a heter to wrap your hands, or wrap your wrap the bread, touch it with gloves on or something like that. But yeah, I would have to just take a look in Shulchan Aruch, the laws of Netilas Yadayim, and see what it mentions there. Because if I remember correctly, like someone has a wound on their hand, there is a heter of wrapping their hand in a towel, instead, because you can't really wash it. If you get water in your inside a cast, it could be quite problematic for the healing. And I don't know, they tell you keep it very dry. I forget what they say why, but it
melts the cast.
No, not because, I don't think it was because it melts the cast. I think it had something to do with,
Maybe it'll get too tight because the water will make I don't know if it'll make it too tight or something. Not sure.
you know what? I have to look it up. I don't know. I have to ask.
Baruch Hashem, I never had one.
Yeah.
No. In any event, yeah. So it's if I remember correctly, there is such a heter to wrap. But the question is that a regular heter? Is it only in a case of need? You know what I mean? Is it only if someone has no choice, they have a cast or something like that, or to what extent? How lenient can you be with that? So yeah, we'd have to look up Shulchan Aruch. All right. In any event, so we have here.
I think I once saw halacha that if a caregiver is feeding someone, that the caregiver has to wash their hands for hamotzi.
Oh, that's an interesting one. You mean if they're feeding straight to their mouth, or even if they're just
right? No, if they're feeding straight to the mouth.
Right.
You have to double check. Don't rely on, but I'm pretty sure I saw that halacha once.
Wow, that sounds like a important halacha to know if that's true. And then the question would be feeding a child, feeding a baby. Would you then need to wash? It definitely doesn't sound like people are aware of it. It sounds like something we should know. But yeah, definitely. Okay, we'll have to look that up as well. Okay, so that was the story with we mentioned yesterday also about Reb Tzadok. Why wasn't he machmir Sukkah like everyone? All the other rabbis were machmir. So we said that it had to do either because he was chayish liyuara, he was nervous that people are gonna think he's showing religious arrogance and like showing off, and that's why he didn't want to go and eat in the Sukkah, or he felt that it's wrong to eat in the Sukkah because people are going to get the wrong impression and they're going to think that you're obligated to eat in the Sukkah on such a small amount.
Rabbi.
And so that was Reb Tzadok's reason why he wasn't machmir. Yes, Ezra.
Well, I checked with the internet. It said that while soft and comfortable, the padding underneath is a sponge for moisture. When it gets wet, it stays wet, creating a damp environment where bacteria thrive. This can lead to skin infections and even more serious conditions like gangrene.
Yeah, that's what I recall, because I had casts numerous times, and I remember they made it very serious, like don't dare get it wet, But yeah, okay, thank you, Ezra. So So regarding Natilas Yadayim, I'm sure there must be some way of washing. So if I remember correctly, you just wrap that hand in a towel for the meal, and you just have your other hand. You could wash the other hand. But I have to look it up.
Wouldn't the cast itself be enough? In other words, the cast. Let's say.
Well, no. Most casts on your hand, on your arm,
So you
they
still
go
have your
up-
finger. You
you
still
still
have
your
your fingers.
fingers sticking
Yeah, okay.
out.
All right.
Okay, so the Gemara, the next piece was the Mishnah. The Mishnah. And the Mishnah was Rabbi Eliezer mentioned about this obligation. We just did the Mishnah. I think let's just start the Mishnah again inside. We're on page 27a. Let's start the Mishnah on 6 lines from the top of the page. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Eliezer says, Arba esrei su'udos, 14 meals, chayiv adam le'achol basukkah. A person is obligated to eat in the sukkah, achas bayom, achas v'achas balayla. One by day and one by night. You're obligated to eat 14 meals in the sukkah. And we mentioned that Sukkot is a 7-day holiday, at least biblically, and that's the way it is in Eretz Yisrael. It's a 7-day holiday. And so you're obligated to have 14 meals. It makes sense. Each day you have one night meal, one day meal. Now, interestingly enough, the Mishnah uses the term one by day and one by night. Now, seemingly it should say one by night and one by day, because the holiday starts at night. The first meal is a night meal. So why does it say one by day and one by night instead of one by night, one by day? So one way of learning this actually answers the question that we asked yesterday, and that is that Rabbi Eliezer is not even talking about the first night. He's only talking about after the first night. The first night is like an automatic obligation to eat in the sukkah. But after the first night, he says there's 14 meals. How do you have 14 meals after the first night? You only have 13 meals. The answer is Shalosh Shudas, the third meal of Shabbos. And every 7 days is always going to be a Shabbos. It has to be a Shabbos. And therefore, it comes out that Rabbi Eliezer is saying that in addition to the first night, you need to have 14 meals starting by the day of the first day of Sukkot. You will have 13 meals, one by day and one by night. Every and ultimately it's 14 meals. So that's one way of learning it, which answers this question about Shalosh Shudas, which otherwise. The other way of learning it is one by day. It's just that often the Torah Pesach Tvarecha Yoir. There's a pasuk that says in Tehillim that you always start with the day, with the light, so it mentions day first. That's another way of explaining why it just says day first, but really the night meal is the first meal. So those are two explanations why it says achas bayoim, achas balayla. Now the problem is if you don't learn with the way I explained earlier that Rabbi Eliezer is excluding, is not discussing the first night. So then it comes out that there's really 15 meals because of Shalosh Shudas. So that was something we dealt with yesterday. And we mentioned the two answers that the Meiri gives, that one of them is that in the laws of Shabbos, you're right, you need to have 15 meals because Yom Tov is 2 meals a day, a Shabbos is 3 meals. And mitzad the laws of Shabbos, you would need to eat an extra meal. But regarding the laws of Sukkah, in the halachas of Sukkah, all you would need is one by day and one by night, because that is those are the regular meals that you would be obligated to eat in a sukkah. In other words, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you need mitzad the laws of sukkah, you have to have 14 meals in a sukkah. Even if it rains, you got to wait till it stops raining. because you need to have 14 meals in a sukkah. At least that's the way he initially seems to hold here. And you would need these 14 meals in a sukkah. And so what will come out is, let's say it rained Shalosh Shudas time, so you'd be exempt from eating in the sukkah for Shalosh Shudas, and your Yotze, the law of Shabbos, having Shalosh Shudas, and you fulfilled your 14 meals of Rabbi Eliezer's opinion that you need 14 meals in a sukkah, because Shalosh Shudas, you don't have to eat. It's a law of Shabbos that has to be eaten mitzad the laws of Shabbos. But mitzad, for the laws of sukkah, you don't necessarily have to eat Shalosh Shudas in a sukkah if you're, so to speak, if you have some exemption. So in other words, the other days you have to somehow try to eat in the sukkah. It's 14 meals you're supposed to eat in the sukkah. But Shabbos, Shalosh Shudas is a law of Shabbos. It's not the law of sukkah. It's not the laws of sukkah. Yom Tov meals. No, you have to have 14 meals for Yom Tov. Shabbos has an extra meal. That's a law of Shabbos. It's not a necessity to eat that in a sukkah. It's that you can't eat it outside of a sukkah. The obligation of eating in a sukkah is the laws of the holiday of sukkahs, which is 7 days, which is 14 meals. So it doesn't mention Shalosh Shudas. That's one way of understanding it. Another way of understanding it is that if you do eat Shalosh Shudas, you are exempt from the night meal, Motzei Shabbos. That's the other way of understanding why it's only 14 meals. Because if you have that meal during the day, you eat an extra meal by day, you're exempt from the night meal, according to Rabbi Eliezer. How do we know that? Because Rabbi Eliezer says afterwards that if you didn't eat the first night, you could substitute it with the night after Yom Tov, the night after the 7 days, Shmini Atzeres. You could fulfill it with the night. You could fulfill one meal with a different meal on a different day. That's after Sukkot. It's Shmini Atzeres. It's not even yet. You could fulfill it. Oh, if you could fulfill a meal from a different day, for sure you could fulfill it for the holiday of Sukkot day. In other words, so if you ate Shalosh Shudas during the day, you'd be exempt from the night meal that night. And the logic behind it is some people eat the night meal early. Once in a while, you have an early bird special. So you eat the night meal early. That's a common thing to do. It happens. So therefore, if you ate Shalosh Shudas, you'd be exempt from the night meal the night after, and then that would all ultimately add up to 14 meals. So that's the way. Now, of course, the Malava Malka is not an obligation per se, a biblical obligation. Malava Malka, it's a Bron Shulchan Aruch, but it's not a biblical obligation, and therefore it wouldn't be included in this calculation. How you Yotze, Malava Malka, and so on. But it's possible to understand that you have 14 meals because so ultimately we have three answers really. Well, number one, the first answer was that Rabbi Eliezer is not talking about the first night in his his calculation of 14 meals, and then his calculation of 14 meals includes one meal for Shalosh Shudas. That's one way of learning. The other way of learning is that we're not dealing with the laws of Shabbos. We're dealing with the laws of Yom Tov. Laws of Sukkot, there's 14 meals of Sukkot. You also, on Shabbos, you have to eat another meal. But that meal is not necessarily intrinsically connected to a sukkah. You just can't eat it outside of a sukkah unless it's raining, whatever. So that would be the second answer. And the third answer is that the Shalosh Shudas meal could substitute for the night meal when you eat the Shalosh Shudas meal. So again, those are the three answers that are given about Shalosh Shudas. And I was expecting there to be an answer about the fact that what we were talking about yesterday, that there's leniencies about Shalosh Shudas, that there's different opinions about Shalosh Shudas. In fact, Tues down on the bottom does touch on the heter of not eating bread for Shalosh Shudas. That maybe you don't need a meal, you don't need it to be you could eat mini targima. And Tues concludes you can't, but there are obviously when he's mentioning that, he's mentioning it because there's other rabbis that said that you could, and that's correct. There are other rabbis that say that you could. So there seems to be other opinions about Shalosh Shudas, but anyway, we don't. From the commentaries, they don't seem to mention here about this this leniency of Shalashus. I will mention one more thing, and that is that on Yom Tov, are you obligated in having a third meal? And they bring a proof from this Mishnah that no, you're not obligated in Shalashudis. In other words, who says that Yom Tov doesn't need 3 meals? Shabbos needs 3 meals. How do you know that Yom Tov doesn't need 3 meals? So the Magen Avraham brings a proof from here that you see that Yom Tov doesn't need to have 3 meals on Yom Tov. You can have 2 meals. Your Yotze, the mitzvah of Yom Tov, with 2 meals. You don't need 3 meals on Yom Tov. So he brings it from here that you see Yom Tov doesn't need 3 meals. Otherwise, it would give a bigger number. You know, Cholamayid we're not talking about. So Cholamayid you can get away. You know, we're not dealing with Yom. But Yom Tov, it would seem like maybe you would need 3 meals. No, Yom Tov doesn't need 3 meals. And so they bring a proof, even though it's Rabbi Eliezer, but the concept is not debated, even though it's not that we follow Rabbi Eliezer's view, but the concept of that he holds how many meals on Yom Tov, you see, he only holds that you would need 2 meals on Yom Tov and not 3 meals on Yom Tov. Okay, that's what the Magen Avraham brings a proof from here. In any event, the Mishnah continues and it says, the rabbis say that there is no set amount. There's no set amount. We mentioned that Rashi adds this interesting line that if you want to fast, we don't stop you. You know, you can fast if you want to fast. But if you eat, you got to eat in the sukkah. But it's not like you need to have 14 meals in the sukkah. If you wanted to fast, you could fast. The question is, what does that mean? If you want to fast, you could fast. I mean, you're allowed to fast on Yom Tov. What's this leniency over here? Rashi's saying you could fast. It's also to fast on Yom Tov. So the understanding is that the din of dwelling in the sukkah, it doesn't obligate you to eat. Yeah, you don't have to eat. With regard to the laws of yeshiva sukkah, there's no obligation to eat. Could you fast? You're not really allowed. You're not allowed to fast on Yom Tov, but it's not that there's an intrinsic obligation to eat in the sukkah. It's that because you can't fast, therefore you got to eat. Once you're eating a meal, you got to eat. You end up having to eat it in the sukkah, but it's not like it's a set rule of how many meals have to be eaten in the sukkah. So that's the rabbi's opinion. The rabbis say excluding milele Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag B'Vad, except of course the first night, then you do have an obligation to eat a meal with bread, first night of Sukkah. So that's the argument. Rabbi Eliezer holds you got to eat 14 meals. The Chachamim say the first night. That's it. After that, you're not obligated. The Gemara says, "My taima the Rabbi Eliezer." I said, so what's the reason of Rabbi Eliezer? Why would he obligate you to have 14 meals on Sukkot? So the Gemara says, because it says Teshu, and it says in the pasuk, the Sukkot Teshu Shivas Yamim, you have to dwell in the Sukkah for 7 days. So the understanding is that Teshvu.
Did you finish the last line of the Mishnah?
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. I skipped something. I'm sorry. I jumped. V'oid Amar Rebbe Eliezer. I skipped a paragraph over there. Thank you for correct. V'oid Amar Rebbe Eliezer. Rebbe Eliezer also said, Mishalei Achal Leila Yom Tov Rishon. If a person did not eat the night, the first night, he didn't eat bread on the first night of Sukkot, so he needs to make it up. So Yashlim Leila Yom Tov He has to make it up on the night of the last night of Yom Tov, meaning the night of Shmini Atzeres. So the night of the last day of Yom Tov, I should say, which is Shmini Atzeres, is the last day in Eretz Yisrael. The biblical last day of Yom Tov is the 8th, the night of the 8th, and that would be the makeup for, that would be a makeup for the first night. That's what Rabbi Eliezer says. Very interesting halacha. And the rabbis say there is no makeup. If you miss it, you miss it. This it says there's a crookedness that can't be corrected. Something you missed out, you won't be able to be counted in for, and that would be this type of case where you missed out on the first night of eating in the sukkah. You cannot make it up. That's the other case of the Mishnah. Again, it deserves to be discussed, and we'll soon see in the Gemara how this what this means really. You missed it. The biggest problem with this paragraph is if you miss eating in the sukkah, so how do you make it up? Eating the night of Shmini Atzeres, you're not even eating in the sukkah that night. So how are you making up what you missed with eating the night of Shmini Atzeres? And isn't Shmini Atzeres also Yom Tov? So you need to eat a meal for Yom Tov on Shmini Atzeres. Anyway, these are sort of the issues that we'll have to iron out when we see the Gemara soon, shortly. Yes. I'm sorry, David. What did you want to say?
This is a pasuk from Tanakh.
Koheles, Ecclesiastes.
Yeah.
But the pasuk doesn't clearly say that this is referring to someone who missed out eating on the first night. The Gemara here uses it. The rabbis use it to say this would be an example of that. But the Gemara's other places give other examples for that. There are many examples of Me'uvas lo yuchal liskain that the Gemara gives. We had in Brachas, Me'uvas lo yuchal liskain, if a person misses davening and it's already after or he either he missed it out on purpose, then he can't fix it up, or if he misses 2 davenings, maybe. No, I think it's talking about if he misses on purpose. If he purposely misses out a davening, I think that's what the Gemara said. It's in the 4th parak, the first page of the 4th parak of Brachas, where it mentions this pasuk over there. But so the Gemara uses this for any case where you can't fix things up, calls it a me'uvas lo yuchal liska. There are certain things you can't fix up, even though we know that Pesach Sheni teaches you there's always a second chance. So the truth is, you can always do tshuva. You always do tshuva.
He translated it as that which is crooked cannot be made straight.
Yeah, well, it doesn't. That's liskay means fixed. So you can translate it that way, but it's not literal. Jeffrey, you had a question.
Two things. And number one, the big problem by eating Suda Shlishis, it seems to me, is when it's Yom Tov and Shabbos together, and you're supposed to be eating another meal in the evening. They tend to be larger meals. So I don't know why that can't be the reference from Rabbi Eliezer, and what he's saying too. So
1 second, Jeffrey. John, 1 second. So one of the commentaries, which is what you're asking on, is that if you ate the meal early, which is what you did, you ate Shalosh Shudas, you're going to be Yoitze, the night meal as well for Yom Tov. So that opinion holds that you could actually fulfill that. Now, as you ate an extra meal by day, it's fulfilling a mitzvah of Shabbos, but it's also fulfilling what he calls his 14 meals, the night meal. According to Rabbi Eliezer, you could do that. And even though it doesn't sound logical that it should work, but if you look at his next statement that you could fulfill it with a meal on the night after Sukkot, so you could also fulfill it with a meal during the days of Sukkot, an extra meal then that you fulfill your obligation. So it sounds like he holds that works. Why that is definitely
okay. So even if it's Shabbos and Yom Tov together, though it's not mentioned specifically. Okay,
now you mean not Shabbos and Yom Tov together. Shabbos and the night is Yom Tov. So you really need a meal that night.
Correct.
That's what your question is really.
Correct.
You really need a meal that night. How do you fulfill the meal that night? And what he seems to be saying is that you could get away with it. That would, that
So-
worked.
So why could the answer about the Tashlumin be the seventh night of Sukkot?
Right. Why does he specifically need it to be the eighth night of Sukkot? Why can't it be the night after? Right. Right. That's a good question. In other words, any day, I was Yaitse the next day. But what it seems like is that the reason he says that seems to be that he holds Sukkot needs 14 meals. You need 14 meals in Sukkot. You missed one of them. After Sukkot, you seem to be able to make it up. But the commentaries don't seem to learn that way. They learn that if you could make it up after, for sure you could make it up on Sukkot. So in other words, if you can make it up on Sukkot,
Right.
any of the meals then should
If you have the right kavana, then it should be
work for it.
good enough.
But what are you going to say? That you'll say is no, but that meal is needed. Those
For the
meals
14.
needed for the 14. See this here, we're talking about shalashudis. It's an extra meal. So I think that would be the difference. That
In other words,
if
not
you had
letting
an
you
extra,
not letting you get a 2-for-1. You can't double up on.
you could double up a little because you could call a Shabbos meal the night meal also for Yom Tov. So you could like get away a little if you play your cards right. You do it that way, it works. But if you try to say I'm making up yesterday's meal with now, that doesn't work because I need it for now. I need this meal for now. But if I have an extra meal, then you could say that extra meal can go for something. That's what it seems like to answer your question, Jeffrey. Yeah.
It sounds like the person's using these shalashudas to make up for malava malka. That's what it sounds like.
Right.
Because he's saying the night meal is malava malka, but I'm going to use shalashudas to make up for malava malka. But you don't do that.
Also sounds like Rabbi Eliezer has the custom of ushpizin, and therefore you have to eat every night.
Interesting. Yeah. Yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, that pasuk from Koheles, I think in another place it says another example is someone who produces a mamzer.
Yeah. Yeah, it does say something like that. Right. Yep. Once, in other words, you could do tshuva, but once you created a mamzer, it's like something you can't really fix up there. That's a big problem. But there is but then again, it also says that there's nothing that stands in the way of tshuva. And ultimately, if you do tshuva from ava, from love, great love, Hashem will somehow cause that the mamzers, the whole mamzer situation will be corrected, so to speak. Okay. Anyway, Gemara.
That's the only correction is that the mamzer dies.
Something like that. Yeah. Right. And there are stories like that where someone did such a tshuva and then he finds out that that sin of his, the whole ultimately drowned in the sea or something. There are such stories. Okay. Anyway, so the Mishnah here used muvas lo yochel liskoin for this purpose of that the rabbis say that you can't make up the first meal if you miss eating in the sukkah. You can't make it up. Okay. The Gemara said that what's the reason of Rabbi Eliezer? And the Gemara says, my time is Rabbi Eliezer, Teishvu kiyein taduru. That the pasuk says Teishvu. And the understanding of that Teishvu means you have to dwell. Sukkah is Teishvu, Shavas, you have to dwell in the sukkah. Oh, you have to dwell in the sukkah? So it has to be similar to how you dwell in your house. As it doesn't just say hang out in the sukkah or something. A sukkah is teishvu. You should reside in the sukkah. So it's ke'ein tadura, similar how you reside in your house. Ma dira, just like in your house is achas bayoim, vi'achas balayla, you have a meal by day and by night. So af sukkah achas bayoim vi'achas balayla. Also sukkah, you have a meal by day and by night. So in other words, it's part of the obligation of dwelling in the sukkah is to have 2 meals a day. That's how he understands that you would need to have these 14 meals. It's based on the fact that a regular person normally has 2 meals a day. But Rabbanon, what do the rabbis do to say that you don't have this ein ladavar kitzvah? You're not obligated to have these 14 meals. So the Rabbanon say kedira. It is like also like your house, that ma dira, just like in your house where you dwell. That just like if you want, you could eat, and if you don't want, you don't have to eat. So also af sukkah, nami, also sukkah, also if you want, you could eat, and if you want, you don't have to eat. So the rabbis understand it to mean that not that you have to have a meal because that's the common thing. There's also the fact that you're free to do as you wish. That in your house, you do as you wish. And if you're not hungry or you're not interested and you don't want to eat, you don't have to. So it's not an obligation. So the Gemara says, oh, really? So then what about the first night? If so, afilu leila yom tov rishon nami, even the first night should also be exempt. And why do the rabbis hold that the first night is an obligation? As the Mishnah said, chutz mi leila yom tov rishon shel chag bolvad, that the Mishnah had said, except the first night. Oh, the first night's an obligation, but why is the first night an obligation? I thought it's like your house, you're dwelling. Teshvu kein chaduru. You dwell. This is the way you dwell in your house. I thought you don't have to eat. So why the first night do you need to eat? So the Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Mishum Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok, in the name of Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok, Nemar Kan Chamisha Aser. It says here on Sukkot that it's the 15th day of the Chodesh Hashvi'i, right, of the 7th month, Chag HaSukkos, right? It says about the 15th day, and and it says the 15th day by Chag HaMatzos, and the Gemara says Mala Halon, Laila Risha, Harisha, and Chayva, just like over there, that eating matzah on the first night is an obligation, mikan ve'elach rishus, but afterwards is permissible. It's not an obligation anymore. Afkan laila rishon chayva. Oh, here also by Sukkot, the first night is an obligation. Mikan ve'elach rishus. Afterwards is permissible. Gemara basically here alludes to another Gemara, but the other Gemara talks about the fact that there's a contradiction with regard to how many days are you obligated to eat matzah. One place it says 7 days, and one place it says 6 days. So the Gemara says contradiction. Which one is it? Are you obligated for 6 days to eat matzah? So the Gemara says, that the pasuk says 6 days. It's basically implying like the 7th day is not an obligation; it's just a reshus. So the Gemara says that if it's only a reshus, and the pasuk is excluding it, lo yilalamed al atzma yotza, ela lalamed al klal kula yotza. That it doesn't only exclude it from the rule of 7 days, but it's showing that all the days are reshus, that all the days of Sukkot are reshus. And when is there? However, the first night is the actual obligation, but otherwise, all the days of Pesach, you're not obligated to eat matzah, but you're allowed to eat matzah. It's actually a discussion if you're getting a mitzvah when you eat matzah. Is there an inyan to eat matzah the other days? Because the Gemara says it's reshus. It's not an obligation, but even reshus, there could be different levels of reshus. It's a reshus. It's a permit. Doesn't mean it's a mitzvah kiyumis. Like it's like fulfilling a mitzvah, like wearing tzitzis, where you don't need to necessarily wear a garment of 4 corners. If you have a garment of 4 corners, you have a mitzvah to wear tzitzis. But you're obligated to put on a garment of 4 corners. Not necessarily. You can wear whatever you like to wear. But it does say that of course, if you want to run after mitzvahs, you buy a garment with 4 corners that has tzitzis, and it says when Hashem is angry, He punishes those that don't run after positive mitzvahs. So you also there's also but it's not exactly a mitzvah in its own right. It's a mitzvah that can be fulfilled. It's a mitzvah you have the ability to fulfill, but you're not obligated really to run. You're not obligated to do that. So the same thing would be matzah. At least according to some opinions, it's a mitzvah every time you eat matzah, but it's still not a mitzvah that you have to run to. So so in other words, you're home and there's matzah on the table. Are you obligated to wash and eat matzah? No. You could go learn. You could go do whatever you want. But there is a way. If you did eat matzah, there is many opinions say that there's I think the Litvische follow the Vilna Gaon that says that. On Chassidim, there's a I think it's brought somewhere among at least among Chabad Rebbeim that there's a fulfill a mitzvah to eat matzah. Anyway,
Rabbi,
sources,
to do that, it has to be shmura matzah if you want to be during the week. In other words, to get that level of the mitzvah, because the regular matzah is not going to work like the first night matzah. So
I'm not. You know what? By us, we only eat shmura matzah the whole Pesach. So
right, but I'm saying, but part of it is that reason for the mitzvah. I think.
Yeah. Otherwise,
every time you eat the matzah, it becomes a mitzvah during
it's
the
only
whole week because it's shmura matzah.
I mean, because they made it l'shem matzah's mitzvah, because it was made l'shem matzah's mitzvah. In other words, there's 2 parts to shmura. Shmura is that it's watched all the way from the time that they harvested, and I think the other thing is that it's not part of the name, but shmura matzah means that they make it l'shem mitzvah. So you're saying only if they made it l'shem mitzvah are you getting a mitzvah when you eat it? That's
right.
Okay. Maybe I didn't think about that. That's have to
well because you only use shmura matzah anyway. So
yeah, for us it's not applicable. But I'm just wondering other people if that would limit it. If it wasn't made l'shem mitzvah. So you're saying you won't get the mitzvah of eating matzah? I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know if it's so limited. I have to think about it. I just have to chew it over. Okay, so in any event, yes, David.
The same way you would say a bracha on tzitzis, Asher Kedeshanu, you would say a bracha on you would say Leisha B'Sukkah, a bracha on Sukkah.
Yeah, so what you're asking is a very good question. I don't know if you realize how strong you're asking a very strong question here. The question that I think you're touching upon is there seems to still be a difference between Pesach and Sukkot. What is that? On Sukkot, every time you eat in the Sukkah, you do say a bracha leishev b'Sukkah. So even though we're calling it Rishus, we're calling it you're allowed to, you're not obligated to, but nevertheless you do say a bracha. However, when it comes to matzah,
yes,
you don't say a bracha ala chilas matzah. The first night you say a bracha ala chilas matzah. The second night for the seder, the second night outside of Eretz Yisrael. But other than that, you're not saying the bracha ala chilas matzah.
awesome.
So there seems to be a big difference between Pesach and Sukkot, and our Gemara seems to be saying that they're both similar. That you have the mitzvah of eating the first night in the Sukkah, and there's a mitzvah of eating matzah the first night of Pesach, and they seem to be both chamisha aser. It's a gzeira shava. It says the same words here and the same words over here, and it teaches us that the first night is a choiva. You have to have like full-fledged meal, a proper meal of bread or matzah, and so the question is, so why is there a difference then? In the rest of the week is only rishus. The rest of the week is only rishus, so that seems to be a little problematic. If the rest of the week is equal, why here do you say a bracha leishev b'Sukkah, and there you don't say ala chilas matzah? right? This is a good question that is discussed. The understanding has to do with the fact that the rest of Sukkot, you're not obligated to eat a meal, but you are obligated to dwell in the Sukkah. The obligation, in other words, you don't necessarily have to eat a meal, but
Right.
there is a mitzvah to dwell
Like
in
the
the Sukkah.
Tues.
And because of the mitzvah to dwell in the Sukkah, therefore, when you do eat a meal in the Sukkah, you're fulfilling the mitzvah of dwelling in the Sukkah. But eating matzah, you don't have that obligation, that chayva to eat matzah.
Rabbi,
So in that
question.
difference, there's room to differentiate between these two things. Yes. Who
And,
was that?
when you're putting on tefillin, and
Yeah.
you're saying the two paragraphs, it says that that matzah shall be eaten for 7 days.
Right. Right. So what I was quoting for you was a Gemara in Pesachim, that it basically it says similar term. It says Shivas Yamim Teichal. Well, it's that pasuk actually. Shivas Yamim Teichal Matzos, and it says Sheishas Yamim Teichal Matzos. So how do you reconcile that? And so the Gemara there in Pesachim, it says that Shvi'i is a davar shahaya b'chlal. It was part of the seventh day was part of the rule of eating matzahs. Then it was yotzim in a klal because it was excluded when it says 6 days you eat matzahs. It was yotzim in a klal in the pasuk in Devarim where it talks about eating matzah, right? And so it says only 6 days over there in Parshas Re'eh. So there, so basically, so the Gemara says it's yotzim in a klal. And the rule with yotzim and aklal is loy lelamed al atzma yotza elo lamed al aklal kulo yotza, and that ultimately it excludes not only itself but even the whole 6 days. And the Gemara says, but the first night is a obligation. 1 second. The first night is an obligation. So that's the Gemara there in Pesachim, and which comes out that it's not an obligation to eat matzah the other days of Pesach. Same thing would be that the other days of Sukkot, you would also be exempt from, ibayachal, ibaylayachal. It's a rishus. You don't have to eat.
Yeah, but
the first night is an obligation. So it says 7 days you eat matzah. So you're asking, so how do you fit? So how do you translate? How do you explain that? So based on what we said, there's two ways of explaining it.
Moshe,
I don't know why I can't. Okay, so there's two ways of explaining it. All right, Moshe, you have to leave yourself muted, please. So the two ways of explaining it is that number one, maybe it's telling you that there is a mitzvah to eat matzah, not a mitzvah, obligatory mitzvah. It's a fulfillment of a mitzvah if you do eat matzah. So that would be one way of explaining that. That's why the pasuk says it's 7 days, but it also says 6 days, because it's hinting to you that there is a mitzvah even when it's rishus, but it's still a mitzvah. Another way of explaining it is not that you're obligated to eat matzah on the 7 days, but it's that you can't eat chametz. So it says, if you're going to eat a meal, you got 7 days, you have to eat matzah. For those, in other words, if you're eating a meal during those 7 days, you need to eat matzah, but not that you're obligated to have a meal. But if you're going to have a meal, it's 7 days, you need to eat matzah. Matzah's yachol. For meals, you got to have matzah those 7 days. But that's the way to explain it.
Rabbi, but the sentence before that is a positive expression. In there it says, Shivat Yamim Tochal Matzot Ubayom HaShevi'i Chag LaHashem. Okay? That's a positive commandment to eat matzah. The one that you are darshaning on is the next one, which
No,
is
Shivas Yavim Teichel Matzis. The Gemara uses that pasuk. Shivas Yavim Teichel Matzis.
And the one
that's what they're
Ezra,
and
right?
the one
Yeah.
after that is in the passive form. It says,
Yachel, right?
Matzot Yerachel et
Right.
Shvat Hayamim shall be
Okay,
eaten.
so they don't use that pasuk. They use the first one that's an obligation.
Yeah,
And they
but
say
this
that
one-
obligation is contradicted with another obligation that says Sheisha Shalom Teichel Matzis.
And this
So
one
how do
comes
you-
along and basically reinforces the first one.
Except for the fact that the pasuk in Re'eh proves that that's not the correct way of explaining the pasuk. Meaning, you're right. Literally, it sounds like that, but that not everything that it sounds like is the way to interpret the pasuk. Just because it does sound like that on a very simple level, but there's a code of how to translate the pasuk, and the code works that if there's davar shahaya b'chlal v'yatza min haklal, that there's a rule of how it has to be interpreted, and that's how you interpret it. That it's to teach you that it doesn't mean a full-fledged obligation. It comes afterwards to explain that it's not like a full-fledged obligation. So it does say you should eat matzah 7 days, but it doesn't mean it as a full-fledged obligation. It basically means either you have a meal, you should have matzah, or if you want to fulfill a mitzvah, you could have matzah, something along those lines.
Rabbi, I'm
Yes,
not sure if this is what Ezra is saying, but it says over here that the first 15, says the 15th is on Vayikra 23:34, and the second mention of the 15th is 23:6. These are the two pesukim.
Yeah, no, we're not talking about that. No, we're talking about the obligation to eat matzah.
No, this is the obligation to eat matzah.
It's talking about
This
Pesach
is-
and it's talking about Sukkot. One is talking about Pesach, one is talking about Sukkot. What you're quoting.
We're talking about Sukkot and talking about Pesach. The first one is talking about Sukkot. The first 15th is talking about Sukkot.
Yeah.
The second 15th is talking about matzah.
Well,
that's
not really. It's called the Chag HaMatzos, but it's the 15th day is Chag HaMatzos Lashem, and then after that it mentions that Shivas Yom Matzos Techel. It does mention about the matzos should be eaten, but that is a little easier. Ezra is not so worried about that pasuk because that pasuk is more of a passive. Matzos Techelu. Well, sounds more like matzos should be eaten. Here, you should eat matzos sounds a little more obligatory. There, you could get away with maybe a little easier saying that, well, matzos should be eaten. If you're going to eat, you have to eat matzos. Something along those lines. In other words, maybe it's not as clear obligation. Shivas yamim teichal matzos. Well, maybe it's the same. Okay. Anyway, bottom line is this is how the Gemara darshans it. So even if you want to say that it is clearly an obligation there, the Gemara darshans that you're not supposed to translate it as literal as it sounds. The Gemara darshans that you translate it to fit with the other pasuk in Re'eh, and that it means more of a suggestion, or more of a if you're going to have bread, you have to have matzah. But anyway, so the main reason the pasuk is the emphasis on the pasuk is that it's chamisha asar that we learn that whatever it says about the obligation on the first night is compared to the obligation on the first night of Sukkot. So Rashi brings this. He says, if you look at Rashi, so Rashi says the Hachi Alfina Lava Parak Basra. So if you want to follow, I'll read it in Rashi. Rashi is the right where it says Gimel Mem, the Gemara. So it's about 15 lines from the top of the page. Mekan ve'elach rishos. After the first night, it's rishos. It's permissible. It's not an obligation. This is what we learn in the last parak of Psachim. matzahs. 6 days you eat matzah. Shemashvi atzeres. And the 7th day is atzeres. So it says 6 days. 6 days eat matzah. Mashvi rishus, avshisha rishus. That it says it's pretty clear that just like the seventh day, it doesn't mention about eating matzah. So it says 7th is rishus. So also the 6 days are rishus. And Lafisha Shvi Bechlau, Shivas Yom Tov Matzah, because the 7th day really was originally included in the obligation. It says 7 days you should eat matzah. And then it was excluded from the rule. It's not an obligation. If you're gonna come and eat, it should be matzah, not chametz. And it's not only teaching about the 7th day, it really teaches about all 7 days. That all 7 days, if you come to eat, eat a meal, you should have matzah, not chametz. You're going to eat matzah, not chametz. Make sure it's matzah. So that's how that Rashi sort of answers this question, and understanding it that way, that's how you reconcile the contradiction. And I share with you a little more from the Gemara there that Rashi doesn't add that doesn't like spell it out so clearly, but the way I explained it is that Gemara really, that Yotzev and Aklal tree was B'chlal, Yotzev and Aklal. So I mean Rashi sort of says it, but I just explained it a little more based on that Gemara. Okay, so the Gemara says, well, Hasam and Nolan. There, how do we know that on eating matzah the first night is an obligation? So that obligation is really where it says, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, the whole pasuk is Barishain Baraba Asa Yoim Chodesh Ba'erev Teichlu Matzos. So there you see the obligation of eating matzah on the night. It says in the Erev, night of the night after the 14th, you should eat matzah. Kosav kavoi chayva. The pasuk establishes it an obligation to eat matzah on that night. So that's the basis. So in other words, it's not based on this other pasuk in Vayikra. The source is really this a different pasuk where it says ba'erev teichlu matzos, and where that is the source that even Sukkahs you have an obligation to eat a meal on the first night of Sukkahs. I just mentioned that there is a famous Bach that some want to say there's an Inyan that you should eat bread made only with flour and water on the first night of Sukkahs to mamish be yoitza, exactly the Gzeira Shava, just like Pesach. Now, it's not that it can't be leavened, but that it should be similar to the obligation on Pesach. Anyway, Sei gesund. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. I should go.
Thank you,
Have a great day, folks.